All right, y'all, we're here to talk about our intermediary first unit of extra credit for the course, which is a brief detour to talk about Aristotle's Poetics, right? Much unlike most of what we've unpacked previously, right? I'm not going to go into a detailed unpacking of um, who Aristotle was, the context of his life, his philosophical and political entanglements, and so on and so forth. Right? Um, I can tell you off the bat there's two things that come to mind when I think about are there complications in translation for this book. Right? The first is age. Right? It is a very old text. It is thankfully in Old Greek. Right? Which means that it is in a very studied language going back to pre-Renaissance, right? So, in terms of like academic study of the language, so we have an okay-ish classical grasp on the language. Not perfect. If I just said that we know the language, I think every classics major would explode. But we have this has been under a microscope for a considerable amount of time. Second, right, is because it's under a microscope by academics for centuries. It makes me wonder how often kind of the specific phrasing of how something is done to push forward a kind of academic agenda of what they're trying to argue is Aristotle's point at a given moment. Okay, um, there's a couple wrinkles that we'll go into later, but I wanted to give us a super brief overview of this because, again, it was for extra credit, but I wanted to explain why this book is important, right? Or why this piece of writing is important and kind of why it pops up, right? Super dense, right? Like I told you that guys that up front, it's hard to get to grips with, right? Um, Probably it might not be the first time anyone stopped to talk about what we will come to know as literary theory, but it's probably the oldest one that we have, right? Um, and it opens up kind of the earliest discussions of what we would call prosody nowadays, right? Kind of the mechanical structure of how poetry works in this book, but also other forms. He talks about the drama and the epic, right? The epic being another subset of the poem, right? All of these things at the time came out of poetry, right? Some form of it, right? And they became new things, right? It becomes the epic, which becomes the drama, right? And then drama becomes all the varieties of theater that we've come to know over history, right? Um, the main two concerns Aristotle has in this book are both in prosody and genre. Okay, um, differentiating the difference between like a lyric poem, an epic, and a drama, right? But also discussions of how the mechanics of how each of those works is what creates the differentiation, right? So we've talked about for poetry structure, language, content, and intent, which we could absolutely use to differentiate genres in subgenres in the poetics, right? But his kind of concerns were kind of melody, meter, and sound, right? Prosody, the specific metric structure of the poem, the way that the characters function in it, right? Heroes and villains and their nature, right? And if you have one and not the other, and if when arcs happen and if they don't happen, it's one thing versus the other, right? And the method of presentation, right? Is it orated, recited? Is it accompanied by music, which a lot of the old epics would have been, or is it performed on stage, right? A bunch of smaller differentiations in venue, right? There's a couple other terms in here that he kind of coins. Um, One of the more common ones that people will recognize is the idea of catharsis comes from this book, right? What catharsis is, and that emotional release is essentially coined and described by Aristotle, right? Much like when you're in your rhetoric classes, everything we're talking about essentially comes from Aristotle. Logos, ethos, pathos, all of that comes from him, right? So it's interesting like how fundamental so many of these phrases were, and you can look at Aristotle's Rhetoric or Aristotle's Poetics or Poetics 2 and see a lot of things that you would recognize today as points of discussion, right? I guess I already briefly covered the specific translation issues that could come from this. It's age and its agenda, right? Which come from a lot of the historical texts that we talk about here, right? But I guess we're talking about agenda in a much less terrifying sense of like broader socio-political and nationalistic agenda, and more just like someone has an argument for what they think Aristotle meant by something, and they translate a line to mean it that way, right? So I guess a question I'd just leave with you in this brief skim over the top of what is a very dense book, right? Despite its size. Is it harder to translate something that has been already explored in great detail, right? And that can be interpreted in different ways. Is it harder in the sense of like making a translation that there's a point to, or to make a sterile new translation where you're not just using other people's work, right? And then what places, and this is kind of a good general question across the course, what places can the translators' secondary motivations besides translating the text, their ideals, their goals, and their agendas, where can they get in the way of having a good translation? Okay. You'll have another video coming up shortly, which is for Apollinaire. All right, so I'll see you guys in that one.